And that's what I think we keep coming back to, even though we're only 3 talks in, or 2 talks in, about to start the 3rd talk. It's that sense of community, isn't it? And community is action and community is power. And I think that's one of the reasons I'm so excited about the next talk, that's going to be led by Jonathan Leighton from Paris. Looks like it's feeling a lot sunnier in Paris than it's here.
Paris in the Greek islands.
Oh, Paris in the Greek islands. It's even better. I thought you said Paris as in France. Oh gosh, I'm even more jealous.
Yeah, so I'm actually, it's the island of Paros, and which actually symbolically, it's about 100 kilometers away from the cradle of democracy, which I thought is appropriate for the session.
Very appropriate.
But I'm not on the cradle of internet technology, so there's a very slight chance I'll be cut off, in which case I'll reappear in 2 minutes. I hope that doesn't happen.
We're dealing with all sorts of technical glitches today, so don't worry, we're all here.
So, yeah, so maybe I'll get started. And so, as you mentioned, Georgina, the session I think really fits well with the thread that was started this morning with the talks by Jamie Caddo and Indra Adnan, and I think we'll be addressing many of the same ideas and issues from somewhat slightly different perspectives. So we'll be discussing a few topics related to the theme of designing ethical governance, including the basic principles behind it, efforts to improve existing governance mechanisms, citizens' assemblies as a model for collaborative decision-making, and the role of personal political agency, which fits in nicely with some of the things that Indra was saying at the end of her talk.
Amazing.
Anyone who's just tuned in now, I'd like to...
Sorry, I was just going to say, I was going to turn my video off so that people can concentrate on you guys, but I'm moderating the chat, so if anyone wants to drop questions in there while you're talking, I'll pick them up at the end, and then we can have a sort of Q&A and things. So yeah, that's all underhand. Okay, great. Thanks, Georgina. So just for anyone who's tuned in the last couple of minutes, I'm going to introduce again my fellow panelists. And I'd also thank them for taking the time to participate and to share their perspectives. So we have Matt Hawkins here, who is the co-founder and co-director of Compassion in Politics. And this is a group that's been campaigning for various initiatives to change how politics is done in the UK. We have Louise Caldwell, who was a member of the Irish Citizens Assembly from 2016 to 2018. And the Assembly's recommendations eventually led to a historic reform of Irish abortion law, among other things. And we have Patrick Chalmers, who's a former Reuters journalist. He's an author and a filmmaker, and he also made a documentary about the Irish Citizens Assembly. So we're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and we'll follow it by a Q&A and discussion session. So I was generously given an hour and a half as requested, so this will give us as much time as we need, I think, to have hopefully a lively discussion at the end. And as Georgina mentioned, any questions can be sent by group chats, and if relevant, please indicate to which panelist or panelists your question is addressed. So to put things in perspective, and we're all aware that we're confronted by many major threats and issues that are occupying our attentional bandwidth at different times. We see the rise in authoritarianism and political corruption. We're all very aware of the huge problem of climate change and the looming threat of civilizational collapse. And then all of a sudden, we find ourselves faced with the coronavirus, which has taken up all of our attention. And then seemingly from one day to the next, our attention is focused to the problems of systemic racism and police brutality. So the question is, how do we deal with all these problems and many others? And how do we ensure that we're giving the priority to each problem, the priority that it deserves? And it raises larger questions. Can we still tweak the system that we have, or do we need a major rewrite of the code? Can we really aspire to significant positive changes globally? And what is the actual path to change? How do we see our individual roles as part of the process? Indra Adnan was talking about the power of individuals in spreading ideas across the globe. But then the question is, what are the key ideas that we want to be spreading? Now, personally, I'm the author of one and hopefully soon 2 books about ethics, and I run a small think and do tank called OPIS, which is dedicated to the prevention of intense suffering of all sentient beings, and also to embedding this core ethical priority into all of our decision making. And so my own interest as an author and ethics strategist is to determine what matters and to try to find effective ways to help nudge things in that direction. And our intuitions may be a very helpful guide to determining what matters, but when we think deeply about ethics, we can help ensure that we're consistent in our priorities and that we remove biases towards our own self-interest. And different cultures may have different values, but ultimately what we would like is a universal ethical framework that encodes some key core principles that apply everywhere. So I like to think of ethics, I mean, there are different ways of framing ethics and saying what ethics is about, but one, I think, very relevant way of thinking about it is that it's about how to meet needs. And unmet needs cause or prolong suffering, which can range from, general frustration with life and with how the world is, to extreme forms of physical pain and emotional suffering. And extreme suffering has a great urgency to it. These are situations that we need to try to prevent from happening altogether and that need to be attended to with the highest priority. So, a couple of examples, people in extreme physical pain who can't get access to effective medication. And this ties in with some of the important, when I say important, some of the key work that we're focusing on in terms of reducing intense suffering. There are people suffering from severe depression and mental illness. This is also a huge cause of suffering that is often invisible. There's the issue of people that don't have enough income to meet their basic needs, and we need to find better ways to distribute the wealth of society fairly. There's violence in all forms, and then there's also the massive industrial scale torture of animals, and this is not a minor issue. There's no excuse for the way society treats non-human animals, and for deciding whether to love them or to pay others to torture them based on external appearance and cultural tradition. But in addition to extreme suffering, we also have to respond to the needs of those who are suffering less, because all of us want to have our own suffering listened to, acknowledged, and addressed. We all want our own lives to matter to others, and some of us may in fact suffer greatly from situations that would cause others to suffer much less. And so only by addressing everyone's needs will we have the widespread support for addressing the highest priority situations with the urgency they demand. So I think we need to create and develop institutionalized mechanisms to listen to the needs of all. And if we do this, there are 2 main rules of doing this. One is that it informs. It makes us more aware of all the suffering that's out there and issues that we may not be sufficiently aware of. But the second rule is that it engages people by making them feel acknowledged and bringing them into the process of finding solutions. It creates cohesion, and it makes people more receptive to listening to the needs of others as well. And Jamie Caddo in his talk earlier this morning was talking about the power of yin. This is the power of receptivity, of listening, of being aware of what's going on outside of us as well as inside of us. And we may not be able to give everyone exactly what they say they want, but more importantly, we can find out the deeper underlying unmet needs and address them. So in my view, our actual decision making from the local to the global level, it needs to be based on 2 pillars. There's compassion and there's rationality. Now, compassion is the desire and the intent to alleviate suffering everywhere, including in the future. And rationality is about taking into account all relevant facts, and that includes the reality of all suffering, knowledge about how the world works, and logical thinking. And with the word compassion, there's the implication of universality, that we take into account the needs of all sentient beings, all conscious beings with the capacity to suffer. Because suffering is an internal phenomenon. It's independent of outside appearance. And we can't create an ethical society that disregards the suffering of some because we decide for superficial or self-interested reasons that they don't matter as much. And this has implications for new decision-making mechanisms, including for citizens' assemblies. Citizens' assemblies strive to be representative of the population, but there are always some groups who won't have a physical presence at the table. And often those are the ones who are most in need of attention, such as people who are suffering from severe medical conditions or severe depression, or, as I mentioned, tortured animals. We need to be methodical in ensuring that the interests of all are taken into account, and that we give high priority to those who are suffering the most. So if we step back and we look at all the conflict in the world, domestically in the UK and other countries, but also between countries internationally, we see that much of the hate can be explained as a consequence of fear, and also hurt, misinformation, and mistrust. And we all know humans are tribal, and humans will often choose their political tribe rather than those who propose reasonable solutions, even when it goes against their own interests. So we need to fight tribalism by creating new affinities that reverse polarization. And I think we can hope to turn things around by showing empathy, even towards those we mistrust, by addressing hurt, by reducing threats, and by being transparent with the truth. And if we can find ways of scaling up the concrete implementation of these principles, I think we'll have a depolarizing effect on society. So, I see a need for new momentum that's unifying, that's ethically grounded, and that's attuned to meeting needs, and not just to change specific policies, but as a basis on which we make decisions, and the basis for facing existential threats together as a society. Now, we can see how our current economic system incentivizes self-interested behavior, and it often exacerbates threats. So we're going to need dramatic changes in economic structures and the incentive structures. And this is complicated. It requires a sophisticated strategy for limiting the capacity of powerful interests to do harm. And this will require approaches that use mathematical modeling, game theory, complex systems analyses. But all of this can probably only be done if there's a strong enough popular consensus for doing so. And so, to sum things up, this is why I think that by reforming the way we do democracy from one of confrontation to one of cooperation around finding solutions that's based on listening and that takes into account the needs of all, we can reduce not only the short-term harm, but we can also hope to build a larger consensus among the population for further transforming our society's power structures, and also ensuring that we can better confront the challenges that we face, and also stabilize compassionate decision-making mechanisms far into the future. And given the threats that we're facing, I think we'd better do it sooner rather than later. So that basically sums up what I wanted to say, and I'm going to hand over now to Matt.
Hiya, can you hear me okay? Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you for that really great introduction, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me along to this panel. So just a very brief background about me. As Jonathan said, I'm Matt Hawkins, co-director of Compassion in Politics. And we've been running for about 2 years. We're a think and do, as that's the popular phrase at the moment, think and do tank. And our goal is to put compassion, cooperation and inclusion at the heart of politics. We are focused on our work in the UK, but we have also done some work in America, Australia, Scotland and Wales as well. So we're starting to spread influence, hopefully. And I think, coming back to what Jonathan was saying, it is about why we set up was about the incentives. How do we get people to want a political system that is compassionate, that is ethical, that meets people's needs? Our sense was that there wasn't really any organisation that was looking at that basic question about why do we have politics? What does it do? How does it respond to people's needs? And the feeling that more and more politics was drifting and drifting away from basic values that people would want to live by. So that's why we set up, and our work is divided between developing policies that we think are compassionate and spread compassion, and on the other side, reforming the political system to encourage more compassion and cooperation. Obviously, that's what we're here to talk about today. I just thought I'd take, for my little space, through sort of 4 basic questions that I think this ethical governance panel speaks to. The first is, well, what is ethical governance? And that is not a question that I would pretend to be able to answer in full in this amount of time, because it's obviously quite a deep philosophical issue. But I do think a simple way to go about it is to consider, well, what would the public consider to be ethical governance? What does it feel like to most people? And we've done and research to try and establish what are the basic values that you want in a political system. And the top things that came out from that, none of this will be a particular surprise, but it's just worth repeating. Fairness, of course, it's that sort of universal value that most people feel. They want to be treated with respect. They don't want to be patronized by politicians, neither do they want to be deliberately misled by them. Related to that, they want politicians to be honest and humble. They want them to be able to admit mistakes. God forbid they would ever make mistakes. They want the system to, where appropriate, be caring. By that, it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, they need a state that is with them at all times, but they do want to feel that there's a person behind the politics. There's a person behind the systems that they interact with, that it's not all about a computer algorithm. Those are the main values that people came back to us and said they want to be in their politics. In terms of how we actually get to that, we think there's a few different things that need to be done. First of all, as Jonathan was saying, is listening. You can't really start to have a political system that governs through representation without listening, without understanding the views that people have, the issues that they're going through, and to do so in with fascination, as is, I think it's Professor Michael West uses that phrase, listening with fascination, where you are completely there to try and understand what somebody is going through. We also don't think you can get there without cooperation. That is something that has been lost to a large extent, certainly in Britain and also in America recently, with polarization of politics. And that's not to say that you can't have sort of like disagreement, and you can't have debates that go left wing to right wing and so on, but you need to be able to cooperate with respect. You need to be able to debate with respect. You cannot expect to improve ideas without bringing as many ideas as possible to the table. Thirdly is trust. We have, in Britain certainly, one of the most centralized political systems probably in the world. So many decisions are made by the cabinet, by those in Westminster, and without radically redistributing political power out from the centre, you will never get a political system that is sensitive to people's needs, responsive to, able to listen, as I said, nor will you inspire trust. You know, when you have a closed off system where people are not able to see behind the mirrors what's going on, the relationship breaks down. Lastly, of course, for us, compassion. And crucially, Jonathan's already laid out what the definition of compassion that we work with is, but also the rationality of compassion. Not only that it is reciprocal, it's the golden rule, you treat others as you would like to be treated, but it also needs to be rational in the sense that you've got to throw it forwards. You can't just have compassion for people alive today. We need a compassion for future generations as well. Otherwise, you know, the decisions that we made can involve tearing apart the planet, serve the needs of the present, but without considering those of the future. So third question that I thought I'd address very briefly is, what is the problem? Why don't we have probably an agreed sense we're not at this state yet? So what is the problem? Our analysis is basically that we have a capitalist politics. By that, I mean that the economic ideals that have been spread since the late 1970s and early 80s of competition, of individualism, of competition being best, has completely taken over our politics as well. And that means that we have a very combative political system. So here in the UK, you basically have a choice between two main parties. There has been a little bit more pluralism recently, but the electoral system still heavily narrows the options down to two parties. That means you get lots of views excluded. It also encourages those two parties to see each other naturally as the enemy. It's all about who's ahead in the polls, Labour, Conservative, Conservative, Labour. Then you get to Westminster and you have the whips. So immediately, personal individual values that led you into politics are taken and sucked out of the system. You can't go and have your own views. You've got to do what the whips tell you, and they can use all sorts of pretty horrendous tactics to make you do that. And the style of debate, highly disrespectful. Mainly it's about, you know, who destroyed so-and-so in today's debate. Well, that's not what we want. We don't want people, we don't need human beings need destroy, we need ideas being constructed. But we're quite a long way away from that. And then, of course, there is the role of the media. And I think the media do hold a lot of responsibility for the way in which that politics has been encouraged. The fact that, as I said, you can't get politicians saying, hands up, I made a mistake. That's not going to happen with our media, which jumps on any mistake and makes it difficult for a politician to admit to being human. And of course, it's highly influenced by a particular group of individuals who want to see a particular kind of politics continued, which makes it very hard for those other views to come in. So lastly, what are we trying to do about that? Our vision, such as it is that obviously we have a much more compassionate, cooperative, inclusive politics, and we're just doing the small bits that we can do to try and get us there. So we want to see constituency boards created at a local level, where you'd have 12 people from the community selected by sortition once every year, and they will then meet with their MP 4 times a year. The basic principle behind that is that you bring MPs and the public, the people that they serve, closer together, and you humanise the process. We would also like to see politicians do work experience in their constituency. Now, that's not to say that there's not brilliant politicians out there who know the constituency they live in and work in very well, but there's quite a lot who probably feel quite divorced from it. So we would like to see them spend a certain amount of time in their community working with the people they represent. We also think you need to change the behaviour in Parliament. We have launched a new code of conduct for MPs, which is designed to get them all to agree to a compassionate pledge where they will treat each other with respect, they will promote compassion, and they will avoid personal or dehumanizing language. All of these things are pretty basic, really, but we clearly need to get people together to create the momentum to make it happen. And lastly, we need to think about how we empower people. And I think what we've seen in COVID, in the COVID lockdown, is amazing empowerment by communities. People who, faced with the lockdown, didn't wait to be told by the government to go and create mutual aid societies. They just went ahead and did it. And the rewards to them personally for doing that, you would imagine, be quite large in terms of their sort of well-being. But also, of course, more importantly still, the rewards to their community and the people that they help. And that's the kind of energy that we need to tap into. It's that natural inclination to care, which builds and leads to compassion, that we need to promote. Say to people, actually, human nature is to be kind and compassionate in most contexts. Obviously, it can be misled and changed. And that's the society we want to build and have reflected in our politics. But I will hand over to others now, and looking forward to the questions and the conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I think we're going to hand over to Louise.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Jonathan. Wow, it was fascinating. I've been scribbling notes like a madwoman here. So much of this is just, it's so broad stroke, but it's so granular at the same time in terms of what needs to happen. So I'll just quickly go through my background and my experience, if you like, of the Citizens Assembly. So I was chosen randomly by a knock on the door. I was at home in my house in the summertime with my 3 kids. And just a random guy knocked on the door, and he had a questionnaire, and he started asking me some questions. I wasn't really sure what he was asking me to be a part of, to be perfectly honest. I hadn't been involved in anything political or didn't know anything much about, how to get involved. I had never really put my head above the parapet, if you like. So anyway, I was quite interested because he mentioned the 8th Amendment, which was Ireland's abortion law. So that had piqued my interest. So I said yes, even though I wasn't sure what I was saying yes to. So the 8th Amendment to the Constitution in Ireland was politically a very hot topic, and it was a hot potato that nobody wanted to touch. It was difficult to talk about, even amongst citizens, amongst themselves. Politicians just really did not want to talk about it. They didn't want to pin their colours to a mast at all because they were afraid of what the damage was going to do to their local constituencies. So a Citizens Assembly, I believe, was a perfect location for this discussion. So my experience of the Citizens Assembly was in, I suppose, we for the abortion on that topic. In total, we did 12 weekends as our group. It was in a hotel ballroom in Dublin. We were at round tables. We had expert speakers who would each come from a different perspective on the argument, and they would present, I think it was about 10 or 15 minutes each on each side. And after this, then we'd have an opportunity for a Q&A, and then there was some private round table discussions and deliberation time. For that, we had a facilitator and we had a note taker. And they were very important. Both of those roles were very important because the note taker was, I suppose, keeping a track of what each person was saying, but also making sure that if one person was dominating the discussion, every time somebody made a point, the note taker would write down a little X, not a little X, but a little cross by your name. So if somebody was dominating, you were generally moved away from, and everybody was encouraged and, compelled more so than just encouraged. You had to talk and you had to give your opinion. So there was conversation starter points for some of those discussions as well, which did help to move things along. So overall, the experience of being a Citizens Assembly member was very positive. The feeling of, I suppose, empowerment, being more informed, it gave me the language, I suppose, to generate discussion outside of the Citizens Assembly with my own family members and with my own friends. I also feel I learned a lot of skills in terms of how to navigate and facilitate difficult discussions, and where people fundamentally disagree with each other about something and may never change their mind on it, and how to do that respectfully. What worked really well was that the secretariat of our assembly was very well organized. So the format was well organized, the timings were well organized, it was chaired expertly, and I can't overemphasize how important all of those things were in terms of people's engagement with the process, and not kind of throwing their hands up going, oh, this is just going on, or somebody not being, I suppose, heard, or somebody being maybe not facilitated and put back down, as in sit back down. Okay, that's grand, we've heard you, now sit back down. So there was a little bit of magic in how our chair did that, and she was a very senior Supreme Court judge, so she had a wealth of experience in that regard. So there was also a steering group, and they were involved in kind of, I suppose, being the spokespeople for the assembly outside of the room and in between the meetings. And the main thing that worked well was that there was space given, and I can't overemphasize the word space. There was space given for people to listen to really difficult material, and sometimes extremely complex, difficult to understand, difficult to join dots, difficult to know what things were connected to which. And, because in our assembly, we had, I suppose, the legal framework, we had the medical framework, we had the ethical element to it, and we had the current lie of the land and the evolution, if you like, of the legal situation in Ireland. So there was a lot to take on board. our speakers weren't allowed to tell us what they thought we should do, obviously. And they weren't allowed to make connections between things. They could really only speak to their piece and to their part. They could provide us outside of that with chunkier amounts of paperwork and reporting as reading. So outside of their 10 or 15 minutes, you know, we could have gotten a 30 or 40 page report from some of the speakers, just with the detail. But it was really, our work was to figure out how these things were connected and to come up with, I suppose, sensible, compassionate, rational, meaningful, and just to speak to the other points, I mean, you know, you've mentioned, Jonathan, you know, compassion, rationality, and even with yourself, Matt, you're talking about, you know, how do we, you know, empower people to behave in a way that doesn't just think of themselves? How do they think, how do they begin to plan for the next generation, you know? And a huge part of what we had to take on board was, you know, the current laws, but also within the context of, you know, the next generation of women coming along and the next generation of medical science as well. I mean, there was a lot in that in terms of making sure that whatever we put in place wouldn't be defunct in 5 years, you know, that it would stand up and it would stand the test of time. So I would say that a citizens' assembly model, how it works, I'd say culture is a big part of what works and what doesn't work in terms of, you know, you would have to really look at the culture of the group, of the country, of the organization, of whatever it is you want to apply this model to. In Ireland, we tend to shy away from openly disagreeing with people. We don't, you know, I mean, just having been in lots of different countries, you'll see people, they'll go toe to toe and they'll hammer it out and they'll straight away be bah, 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 you know, without falling out with each other, which to Irish people kind of seems really unusual. So this platform worked particularly well because we were mandated to speak our minds. So, you know, we had to give regard and consideration to all of the presentations and we had to discuss the topics using the conversation starter points. So we couldn't get away from having the conversations, and that was really important because we would typically shy away from that. What would I say in terms of what could be changed? We weren't paid to be part of the Citizens' Assembly. I personally had no problem with that. It was fine. I was well supported at home. My husband, you know, was as happy for me to go every weekend, and he had the kids and all that. But when I think about the payment from a different perspective, so we were selected through random stratified selection. But there definitely must have been some form of a selection bias because people weren't being paid. So only people who could afford to give up all that time and were coming from a supported background could really say yes. So, and I often tell the story about, you know, somebody asked me once, why did you say yes? And I described the moment when this man knocked on the door. And I said, you know, I've been at home all summer with my 3 kids, and here's a man standing on my doorstep. And he said something about going to a hotel once a month to talk about adult grown-up things. And before I even knew what the topic was, I was like, sign me up. I don't care what it is. I'll do it. So you have to understand that it'll get people in the door, you know, but it won't make them stay. So my reasons for yes was, yes, of course, I was interested in the topic. But secondly, I was happy to the idea of going to spend a weekend talking to grown-ups. It was wonderful. But as soon as I was in the door, I really, really wanted to be there, and I understood what it was, and the message of what it was we were trying to achieve became more apparent. So some kind of a hook to get people in the door. And I think money can be the one, you know, and I think it would be important. And I know that Scotland has taken that on board now, and I believe they've paid their Citizens' Assembly participants a stipend just to cover their time. So the format's important, and the deep knowledge that you learn. You know, we think that we know something about something. We always do. We always think we know something. But then you realize when you go into an environment like a Citizens' Assembly that you actually really know nothing about this topic at all. You thought you had an opinion. Well, you had an opinion, but it was really not rooted in any kind of learning or knowledge. That's what you thought. You figure that out very quickly. Another learning for me was that people are really open to having, you know, meaningful discussions, and they're open to trying to understand more once the platform is made available to them. And I believe that this kind of platform can be a real vehicle for change, because it sets the bar and it can depoliticize an issue and just let people speak and let them figure out what is the best for us as a collective now, and as you mentioned, Matt, you know, for the future as well. It's not just about us. And when we did do the final vote eventually at the end of our 5 weeks, I mean, I couldn't have said at the time what way it was going to go. Even around the tables, I wouldn't have been certain who was going to vote what, because most of the time we weren't telling each other what we thought. We were just asking questions. We were asking each other questions, going, do you remember what he said about that? Was that connected to that? Right, okay. So it was mostly asking questions. So if I had to do a survey of the room in my head of all the tables I've been at and, you know, try and guess what people would have voted, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So we shocked ourselves with the vote that we did, to be honest. And it's staggering, because the political response to our recommendations was shock and horror. Is that there's just no way this is going to pass. Ireland is not ready for this. There's just no way. And our recommendations then went to a parliamentary committee, which went through, essentially it's a mini citizens assembly. And from there, several politicians, including the political leader of one of our main parties, changed his mind. So that's really powerful. You know, he made a complete about turn, and it was because of the process. So I think that's really, really valuable, and it's really worth kind of overstating that, if you like. So I'd love to see citizens' assemblies, a mini, right up to like the 100 people one that I was in, you know, to form part of our democratic and our political systems going forward. I mean, I came out of the process with a new respect, actually, for politicians, because this was just one topic. And it took us 5 weekends, and the amount of reading we did before, during, it was incredible to be able to come up with a good set of recommendations. So if you think about the amount of issues and topics and things that pass by a politician's desk on a daily basis, I mean, I don't have a clue how they do their job. That is the truth. Even with somebody reading everything for you, I don't know how they do it. So the conflict, I suppose, between the objectives of a politician and, you know, societal objectives, you know, that can be really smoothed, I think, with this format and with this mechanism, you know, because it isn't just about us now, and it isn't just about, you know, how we want, you know, because, you know, and it struck me, Jonathan, what you said there about, you know, compassion and the alleviating of suffering, deciding that one person's suffering is less important than the others. Like, that was the crux of what we were trying to decide in the Citizens' Assembly on abortion, you know, because it was deciding that what had been put into our constitution was that the 8th Amendment said that there would be equal right to life for the unborn and the mother. And that is what caused the problem that we ended up in, which was, you know, both legally and medically, there was no way around that, because you can't have equality in that situation, because sometimes somebody has to take preference, you know, and very often it was the mother in a medical condition situation. So it's just interesting, you know, that this is the crux of what we're talking about. And even in that situation, a citizens' assembly proved to be a really good format and mechanism to have really deep, meaningful discussions that did go forward. And when you see the vote, the results of the vote of our room, of our group, I think we were something like 65% for yes to change the amendment. We were 67%, I think. And when it went to the public vote, it was actually, I think it was about a percentage and a half out. I think they were maybe 67%. So it was so close. It was so close to what the general public ended up voting. So that was staggering for me. So yeah, another little point, Matt, I wanted to make as well, is what you mentioned about the media. The media reporting on the Citizens' Assembly was really important. And in Ireland, we have, obviously, like yourselves in the UK, we have a public broadcaster, so we have RTE. And to be fair, they did keep the reports factual. Something that struck me when I was giving a talk in Scotland at the announcement of the Citizens' Assembly in Scotland is the media in the room mentioned that they didn't want to report on the process. They said they would rather wait until they saw some kind of consensus and then they would start reporting on that. So I said to the chap, I said, look, if you wait until the end, you've missed it all, because the reporting of the process is what is most important. It's the changing and shifting of people's attitudes and behaviors as we go along. That is the news, not the decision at the end. So, and that was really important, because the reporting and the media, you know, and what was coming out of our assembly, and ours was live streamed, you know, it changed the lobby. It changed the messages of the different lobby groups. You know, they were responding to what they were hearing us saying. So yeah, that's really all about my experience, and I look forward to hearing Patrick's.
I'll just go for it, shall I, Jonathan? Thanks, Louise. It's really lovely to hear you speak, Louise. You speak with such extraordinary clarity and enthusiasm and passion about the Citizens' Assembly in Ireland, and you're actually the only person on this panel that I've actually met face to face as well when I came over. And you know, you were speaking very clearly then, and you speak ever as clearly now. And somehow the Irish example cannot be championed enough. It is a national level use of a Citizens' Assembly on an incredibly difficult subject, which survived the Citizens' Assembly process. It then survived the parliamentary process. It then survived the Prime Minister or the Taoiseach's office, and then it survived the referendum process. And it could have failed at any of those stages. And the reason I make that point is because I think Citizens' Assemblies are great. I think they're great because, precisely as you described, they allow a channel for alleviating tension, for accommodating strongly held difference, and then arriving at a deliberated, which means everyone's had their contribution, consensus, and an outcome. But they're incredibly fragile. So Ireland got the result, which Louise and her co-participants really were the creators of, which is that women and girls in Ireland today have world quality reproductive and sexual health provision and rights. And that is a real thing in the real world. This is not something technical or something abstract. It's real. And that is obviously important for every woman or girl in Ireland, but it's particularly important for the poorer ones, because they were the most disadvantaged by the previous arrangement. They were the ones who couldn't afford to take a plane to the UK or to the Netherlands. They were the ones who had to keep it quiet wherever they were, and then maybe to have had a child that they didn't want to have or weren't able to look after. So Ireland did the world, really the world, a huge favor in having and succeeding in having a Citizens' Assembly. So what you heard from Louise is a person who started out as an ordinary citizen, and then with the other Citizens' Assembly members, became a hugely informed and expert person in deliberative democracy, and her being a champion of that today is evidence enough. We are all actually ordinary citizens, every one of us, and there are about 7.8 billion on the planet. Most of them don't look like me, and they don't look like Matt, and they don't look like Jonathan. Half of them are women. So hooray for Louise on our panel. Most of them are not white either. So we're talking about ethics in politics, and I am a 54-year-old white heterosexual male, rich, from Europe. So I'm not really the person to be doing this. And I'm not trying to do any, what they say, virtue signaling. Look at me, how woke I am, because I'm not woke. You know, I'm doing my best and, you know, blundering at every turn. But another ordinary citizen turned expert in deliberative democracy is a woman called Maya, Almeida Amir. And Maya, she was on the UK Citizens Assembly for Brexit. And Maya would describe herself as a person of colour. And she had a pretty tough time on the Citizens Assembly on Brexit, which, as you can imagine, you probably haven't heard of. And if you have heard of, you'll know that ultimately, although functionally it worked, it was a sort of waste of time because the outcome didn't have any traction with politicians and didn't produce any result. So Maya's experience was, maybe for me, as someone who's obsessed by democracy innovation, Maya's experience was the most fascinating thing that came out of that Citizens Assembly. And that was to say, and I saw her in Edinburgh at a talk on the Citizens Assembly on a panel where there were a few fellow participants and some academics. And Maya, with great lucidity and also, I think, courage, made the point about how being numerically the person of color, or among a few people of color on the Citizens Assembly, wasn't enough. And that wasn't enough because, for example, as Louise just touched on, the notion of being paid to be on the panel. So there were people who, you know, they need childcare. There are people who have jobs or 0 hours contracts who cannot make themselves available for citizens' assemblies. There are people who can't afford to leave whatever it is they're doing to be on that citizens' assembly. So paying people is not a luxury. It's like, if you want a representative sample, you need to pay them. But the point for Maya was having numerically representation of people of color wasn't either sufficient. And she said that because she was having to deal on the assembly with fellow assembly members, I suppose, unconscious racism. The people on the assembly would not have called themselves racists, but as you know, all those descriptors that I used for myself at the beginning of this, I am racist. Patrick Chalmers, I am racist. And why am I racist? Is because I can't possibly know the lived experience of people of color. There's no way. You know, I was born in the north of Scotland. I've got a posh accent. I am white. If I have an interaction with a police officer, it's extremely different from what someone who's a person of color might have. So Maya on the panel was dealing with the embedded racism of the system, so systemic racism, in her experience as a participant on the Citizens Assembly panel. So I make that point, first of all, to bring her voice here, but also to sound the alarm to say, I love citizens' assemblies. I think they're great, but they are not the panacea. They could be part of a solution, but they are not the whole solution. And you know, what am I going to spend? I've got another 2.5 minutes of my 10. What I'm interested in is this notion of systemic racism as part of ethical politics. So, and I make it with my sort of clod-hoppering manner because I don't have the lived experience of it. I have the sort of learnt experience of it. But, you know, we need political systems which most certainly are like those that Jonathan and Matt so eloquently laid out. They do need to be ethical. They do need to be compassionate. The elements that Jonathan laid out, compassion and rationality, most certainly need to be part of those systems. But for me, they need to take a reality check on the existing inequalities on our planet. I'm speaking to you from a field in southwest France, but I am British, but this is where I live. And so I look back at my country of birth and tear what's left of my hair out at the disastrous politics of the United Kingdom. You know, Ireland has a written constitution. Ireland has now some track record with genuine world-beating democratic innovations. The United Kingdom, my United Kingdom, is a car crash. And it's a car crash on a global scale. And it's taken coronavirus to show us that. So for me, having a sort of code of conduct for UK MPs is fiddling while Rome burns. It is deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, we have this year what is looking to be the hottest year on record. We are in the climate crisis. It is now. And our political system, and I can share the article that makes this very eloquently, that came out today on the platform I write for, which is called The Correspondent. The climate crisis is underway. We are the hottest year on record building towards. And the question of racism, the question of equality, the question of colonialism, and you know, I'm from the UK, so we know about that, is front and center of whatever we can do in the crisis situation we're in to sort out our politics. So the challenge is massive, and it is now. So we're in the middle of the year this weekend. You know, the Campfire Convention is the solstice event. We're halfway through the year. And we need to sort of raise our level of engagement, both personal, but also intellectual and mental. What we do, where we live, but also how we engage politically, several levels above what we've done so far. Because not me, because I'm who I am and where I come from. People are dying now because of our dysfunctional political systems. Right today, in the Mediterranean, in Libyan sort of torture centers funded by the EU aid budget, these sorts of things. This is happening now. This is not some sort of abstract, nice to have, shall we fix our political systems? It's like, fix it or we're finished. It's as bad as that. So that's my 11 minutes. I've taken a minute extra. I'm very grateful to Pete Lawrence, and I'm very grateful to Jonathan Leighton for bringing me onto this panel. I'm sorry if I am sort of, you know, as it were, the spoiler of the picnic, but you know, that's what we need to do. And thank you anyone who's out there, because it's very, very strange talking to your computer screen. Thank you anyone who's out there who's joined, and you know, for giving up your time. And that's my time, so thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Patrick. Yeah, there are a lot of, you know, obvious questions that that are raised by your various perspectives. I want to maybe go right away to some of the questions that have come in on the chat.
Oh, Jonathan, you've muted yourself.
It's because I took my finger off the space bar.
That's all right.
So, Nicholas Holden, his question is, how important is the physical presence in a citizens' assembly? So what would an online form of citizen-driven democracy require to be a place where listening and deliberation on complex and difficult questions happen without devolving into impatience and tribalism? So how can this be done online rather than physically? Whoever wants.
Happy to comment on that. I've actually been asked this question very recently by a group who are considering, in the current context, running, they had planned an in-person assembly, and now they're looking at doing it remotely. There is something about the magic in the room that I don't know if it's possible to replicate online. There's also the tea breaks, the lunches, the mini conversations, the breakouts, all of the, you know, non-core elements. It's like being at a conference, you know, you don't go really to look at the speakers, it's all the connections that you make in this peripheral kind of stuff that goes on that really stands to you and your network and your, you know, understanding or learning or whatever. But that's not to say that it's impossible, because I do think it is possible. I know that in Madrid, they have a platform called Consul, which they used very successfully to engage in a deliberative process with the residents of Madrid in how public money was spent in particular neighborhoods. And this platform allowed people to make their suggestions for what could change on this street or that street or this park. Everybody voted on them, people commented on them. Certain ones got approved, some didn't. So it was very much done online. And that platform is called Consul, C-O-N-S-U-L. And I know that they use it across a lot of cities, in particular around Latin America, because it was originally developed in Spanish, but I know it's open source. So I'm sure there's ways to use that for different deliberative processes. So it is being done, and it has been done, and I think it's possible, but you will lose some elements, but you may also gain some in terms of, you know, it's obviously more accessible, but you definitely would have to have it less, shorter and more often, you know. So you couldn't have somebody on a full day of Zoom, you know, make you want to cry. So.
Yeah, Patrick?
I'd just say very briefly, because Louise speaks so much more powerfully to that, the British Citizens Assembly on Climate got COVID hijacked. And so they have actually tried using online assemblies or weekends meetings. They have the advantage, obviously, of having started face-to-face, so they've met one another, and then they're going online. But I think what Louise is saying about the physical experience strikes me, and I filmed the one in Ireland, strikes me as a really valuable part. I don't know if it's essential, but it's certainly a deeply enriching part of the process.
It's interesting if you can compare it with what's happened with the actual parliament. It seems to be the opposite, that going online seems to increase the civility of discourse. You don't have a bunch of jeering MPs in the background every time somebody makes a point. Matt, do you have any comments on this?
No, I think Louise summarised the point really well. It is. I think if the digital helps engage, gets people involved who wouldn't otherwise, and I just think that has to be very carefully thought about how you bring in. You don't lose things during doing that, but it seems like it's an essential part of the process.
So we have a question here from Helena, and just scrolling and holding the space bar at the same time. And her question is, what do you think about the idea of politicians having to complete a course on empathy and anti-racism before running for election? So Matt, maybe you'd like to have a go at that, because that seems to be...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great point, definitely. The problem has been, so taking a step back, Patrick, I think, made a very good point that something like a code of conduct is small fry compared to some of the big things that need to happen. Our view, I guess, is that there's a strategic question here about opening the space for those kind of conversations. And when we drafted the code, we then started to engage the Speaker of the House, the things like Committee on Public Standards, and what we were just amazed to find in our naivety was the lack of regulation and rules that Parliament has. So essentially, Parliament is a rule unto itself in the UK. And what goes on in the House is basically decided by the Speaker, which is obviously a very political role. So we kind of just want to get Parliament up to a standard where it conforms to what most other places of work have to go along with. So they would normally have a sort of written code. I mean, there is a code of conduct, but it's quite out of date, and it's not really up to scratch. So where you have a code of conduct, where you have a bullying policy, there's not even a bullying policy for Parliament, and where MPs are treated, and it's not good for MPs either, because some might benefit from that sort of freedom, but a lot will be discriminated against, as we've been hearing already from other speakers. So I guess my point is, yes, something like that is essential, but we also have to do wider work just to bring Parliament up to scratch with what goes on for most people, most employers and employees in the rest of the UK. Because if you can't have what should be it's the highest seat in the land in a way, setting a very good example, you do have a real problem. And that is partly why we want to make those small changes, because of the bigger example that it then sets to the rest of the country.
I'm going to move to the next question, and this is from Jamie Woodhouse. Hi, Jamie. And the question is, a central decision redesigning ethical governance is whom we should have, or whom we have compassion for. And actually, well, I know what Jamie's stance is on this, but his question is, should we extend compassion to all sentient beings, so any beings that are capable of suffering, as my organization OPIS does, or should we stick with human-only compassion as the default? Any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to go, but also aware I just answered the last question. So if someone else wants to go first.
Go ahead.
Louise,
I think Patrick, are you coming in?
Yeah, I suppose I'd be happy to. I can see Louise has got her mic off as well. I think my very quick point would be to say, yes, I am someone who used to shoot things, transitioning to vegetarian, to probably ethically, morally should be a vegan, but I haven't got there yet. So that I'm definitely on that page. And I think, you know, having the planet livable for all living beings is most certainly what we should be aiming for with our political system. But I think the counter to that is the priority should be on fellow humans. And it should be on the fellow humans who are dying most and earliest because of our political system. So yes, for all living beings, but first I would personally want to look at fellow humans.
Anyone else want to comment on
that? I'm happy to. I mean, compassion in politics, as I said, we're about how we promote compassion in all aspects of life. So whether that's between politicians, from politicians to the public to the politicians too, and then throwing it forward to the future generations. And I think our view would be, we probably wouldn't go in with a kind of prioritization process. Rather, we would think, well, actually, you just need different processes to encourage people to have compassion for the environment, for people, for future generations. There's just going to be different psychological mechanisms you're going to have to work with. But I think we also see the role, we also see it quite holistically, as in compassion for yourself, compassion for others, compassion for the planet. It's all part of a benefit, and it all has feedback mechanisms that, you know, that help. So if you have compassion for your environment, you build green spaces that people can enjoy, that's good for people too. So it's sort of, we don't try, as simplistic as this might be, but we don't try and sort of segment off. It's more just about what levers do you pull to bring compassion for all and for non-sentient beings as well.
Yeah, we have a couple of just comments on this point. You know, why humans first? And somebody else, Annie, who was seconding that question. I mean, I'm not going to repeat things that I've already said in my introductory talk, but I would say that it really isn't a matter of having to make a choice. Just as we're faced with many different issues in the world, and you know, we have to deal with them in parallel. I think the same can be said about different sources of suffering in the world, whether it's, you know, humans suffering from disease who can't access medication, who are suffering from depression, climate change. I mean, it's not like we're not going to be addressing them sequentially, because all of these things are urgent, and working on one doesn't mean that we can't work on another at the same time. You know, we can try to address the causes of climate change, and at the same time address the you know, the horrors of factory farming and other abuses of animals. So that would really basically sum up my point. Patrick, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I suppose I should answer. I can't say if is it Silic and Annie, just why humans first. I suppose I should qualify what I just said. That is my point of view amongst 7.8 billion people, and I think what I should do is retract that and say, I think what we need is a decision mechanism for 7.8 billion people that can actually settle that question. So I, as one of them, you know, who cares what I think? I think the notion of who decides the priority of political action today, for example, is not mine to make. So I bow my head to the question, is what I say.
Louise?
Yeah, so if I could just add, I mean, I think what we're all trying to say, I think, is that, you know, this kind of has a cascading effect. You know, at the first level, we have to raise awareness and compassion. And I think once you awaken awareness and compassion in people, it doesn't stop, you know, it just continues to grow. And if you provide the systems and mechanisms and support and learning and understanding and knowledge and all of that, you continue to support that and we continue to move in that direction, I think it can only expand outwards, you know. So I see why you would say, yes, humans first, because there's enormous suffering among humans. I can see why you would say everybody first, including all sentient beings. And I think that some of them, as you say, Jonathan, are inextricably linked. You know, the suffering of animals, the suffering of the climate, of the planet. You know, yeah. So I think if we can manage to get this moving, I think there will be a cascade effect.
Yeah, thanks, Louise. I mean, I agree with you. I think that spreading compassion in general is sort of a kind of a meta level way of thinking about implementing change, changing our values and changing how we, you know, expanding our moral circle towards all others, and, you know, becoming more attuned to the suffering and the needs of others. There's a specific question here again from Helena. Would it be a good idea to post all the expert talks online during the Citizens Assembly? Louise, what do you think of that?
Yeah, so our whole assembly, it was all streamed live. All of the expert panel, all of the expert panelists, all their talks were streamed live. So you could watch it live from anywhere, and you could watch it then later on demand. So I think it's very important just to be able to broaden out the audience for the deep knowledge, if you like. And then the private roundtable discussions, the cameras all went off for that. That was all in private, just to make sure people didn't feel like they couldn't say what they wanted to say, but there was nobody watching them.
I actually had a question for you guys, if you don't mind. Citizens assemblies, they seem, I know we're saying that they're not the overall solution, because there's obviously a lot of issues surrounding them of who's in them and then what happens to the information afterwards, or the decisions that are made there. But for people who are watching who want to try and get involved in citizens assemblies, or want to sort of, where do they go next? How do people take this kind of inspiration from your amazing talks today, and where do they go to get more information? Or how do people get, I know, Louise, you were saying obviously a man knocked at your door, but how do people get involved in citizens assemblies?
Mute myself. So I think the basic premise of a citizens assembly is that you can't self-select. I think the main reason for that is that we all know this from kind of committees and whatever, that, you know, it tends to be the same people who put their hand up every time, and then you end up with that particular group and the dynamic and, you know, certain type of person only involved who would have been engaged anyway. So I suppose the beauty of a citizens assembly is in the random selection. So I think it's, rather than, you know, self-selecting, I think what people can do, and I've thought about this a lot in terms of what can I do, like citizens assembly can happen on a national level, but they can also happen on a really micro level. And there's a lot of information actually. If you search up citizens assembly, I think it's .ie, or I'll share the link. I'll look it up now. That's what I was actually doing when I forgot to unmute myself. I'll share the link now, but there's a wealth of information up there that's been shared by David Farrell and Jane Suter and Clodagh Harris, who were the designers, if you like, of the Citizens Assembly, and they were the lead researchers on the Irish Citizens Assembly, and they've actually done a lot of the groundwork. The chap up in Edinburgh as well, Oliver Escobar, he's incredible. He's published an amazing amount of really useful material that if anybody was considering a citizens assembly, like for example, you know, one of my daughters, my eldest one, she's in secondary school now, and you know, even in terms of how they elect their school student council, I believe that should be done by a citizens assembly. You know, they should look at what the issues are, identify the issues, and, you know, go through a process that it shouldn't be, because it's always the popular kids that put their hands up and say, I'm going to go for election because I think I'll get elected. You know, so it's just a change. And I think that the message that that would give even to that age group in terms of empowering people who would never have self-selected to go and put themselves in a situation where it's been democratized, if you like, and it's the five, this is not going to sound like the right thing to say, but the five unpopular kids who are now going for election as opposed to the three main popular ones. So I think that sends a really strong message to children at a very, very impressionable age, where you can give them that sense of empowerment and show them that somebody can come from completely left field if they're given the opportunity, and they might run with it just as well as anybody else would.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that, going back to what a lot of the talks have sort of had that combines them today, is that sense of individual action and individual power, because given the chance, everybody can be that powerful. Like you said, it's getting that selection right, isn't it? And giving the people a chance to speak that wouldn't normally. You're still on mute, Patrick.
Yeah, Georgina, it's a great question, and I can't resist opening my big mouth again. Perhaps one thing here is this notion of our democratic self as an individual, and we tend to get educated to be obedient and to follow a very parental structure, and you know, patriarchal, even the father figure who leads us. We live in patriarchy, there's no question. And so our tendency is to sort of think, yeah, okay, let's keep elections and then put other bits alongside. I personally think that elections themselves are the problem, because elections are very passive for most of us, which is like, I'll vote every 5 years or so, and then you go away and sort it out. And that's very problematic for our personal agency, for the idea that I am a unique human being who can actually do something where I live. And so we're sort of, we're treated like sheep, and we behave like sheep. And what we can do today is to say, I am no longer that sheep. And in the UK, you have flat pack democracy. And I know that a lot of people in Campfire know about Froome and flat pack democracy. You have the Transition Network, which is in the UK, but it's also globally. You have Extinction Rebellion, who have a program now of Trust the People, which is an incredibly rich resource in organizing locally. You have coronavirus affinity groups, so street neighborly groups. You have something called, which you'll find on Alternative UK, which Indra was on the previous panel, I think, neighborocracy, which is an Indian idea about basically getting to know your neighbors and doing stuff with them. Because, you know, most politics, it doesn't take place in capital cities. It takes place where we live. You know, it's the school, it's the transport, it's how we look after old people, it's access to medical services, it's what we do for social exclusion, it's how do we deal with addictions. You know, that the guy who's drunk on the high street is usually some physical or mental health issue that puts him on the street. It's not, you know, some personal failing. So politics is local, and unfortunately our mentality is that politics is in the capital somewhere, and it's mummy and daddy who are going to sort it out. But actually, we need to be adults, is what it boils down to.
And I think we were talking in Indra's last talk as well about how the lockdown and the pandemic has really shaken our sense of being sheep, and actually given us some kind of agency back. I mean, if we can organise mutual aid groups up and down the country, and 1 million people want to volunteer to help the NHS, how can we take that sense of goodwill and willpower and wanting to help and really turn it into local politics and turn it into local action beyond the COVID pandemic? Oh, Jonathan, you're on mute. There you go.
Hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I was just going to say, Patrick, I think that's I mean, it's a really important point about the power of local politics, or whether you want to call it politics or not, but of local organization and people looking after one another in proximity. I think it's clear that some of the problems obviously can only be solved at the centralized level, especially when it's dealing with with international issues like climate change. So the question I wanted to ask is basically, what kind of path we see going forward to be able to tackle these kinds of problems. I mean, do you see, and I'm addressing this to all of you, do you see the current system evolving from within, or do you see the current powers that be in London and other capitals voluntarily giving up some of their power to new structures? What do you think is, I can say, what is the ideal path, the ideal vision, and what is maybe a likely one forward? Does anyone have sort of a pretty broad question, but what are your thoughts on that?
So I have a quick thought on, so one of the places I've been very impressed with, where I've seen some great work, is in New York. They have an organization called participatory budgeting. And I think that can be a really strong signal that at a very local level, if you put money that's already going to be spent and you put it in the hands of the local people to decide how that money gets spent, you watch the word spread about that, and you watch people get engaged in their local communities. And this is not, looking for extra funding for something. This is simply taking budgets that exist already for communities, for public spending, and devolving the decision-making for that budgeting to include citizens of that locale, council, neighborhood, whichever. I think that is a really fast way to get people engaged. If you show them money and show them the results of that in action in their locality.
I'll come in. So I think it's a very difficult question. I think that we have to go back to sort of some of the points that have been made, that it's about finding out what kind of system people want and what they want that system to do for them. And it's not easy for us to sort of make that claim at the moment. Our sort of strategy, I suppose, is that we look at the motivations that bring people into politics and how do we sustain those motivations while they're in politics. And most research does suggest that there are some very good intentions for why people enter politics, but once they're there, those, as I said, get sucked out quite quickly. And even the most well-intentioned of people, only if they're going to jettison most of their good intentions are they going to stay and rise through the system. So that's kind of what we're looking at, is how do you diversify the types of people who are in politics, the people who see themselves as being politically active, and then how do you create a system within Parliament which retains space for compassion, cooperation, inclusion, respect, because then you get a whole series of sort of virtuous feedbacks in which people are much better represented. They see politics as something they want to go into. They feel that they can trust their MP to raise issues. And that's, so, that's the ideal anyway. But also we clearly need to redistribute power. How we convince politicians to do that, I'm not really sure. I think we just have to use the best practice examples we've got, like Ireland, to show what an impressive impact it has, and show that the UK, or certainly Westminster, is falling behind most other countries in Europe now. And it's going to have to play catch up if it wants to be given the respect it feels that it deserves. That's my sort of rambling, potted answer.
I mean, I'm happy to add my rambling potted answer to Matt's, and it's probably going to be far more rambling and far more potted. But we're faced with the eternal dilemma of optimism versus pessimism. You know, you can look at what's happening and you can see an unholy shitstorm out there, whether it's climate change or species loss or migration or creeping fascism, you know, and you know, the moving towards some sort of knock on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning situation in an increasing number of countries, because that is there, and that is, you could say as the pessimist, that's what we're looking at. And then you can flip to the optimist, which is to say, yes, but these are the thrashings of a dying system. And we are looking at this shitstorm precisely because the system is doing its worst as its last fling. And frankly, take your pick. You know, I don't need to, on a conversation about ethics to introduce Stoicism. Jonathan could talk to us about that at length. He's in the right country. But the Stoics knew that, and what the Stoics did was they took themselves away from the personal to have a global perspective of the nature of life and a life well lived, and also the inevitability of death. So here's the news: we will all die, and we've got a finite amount of time before that happens. And really, it's a question of if we can live that gloriously. And for me, politics is part of the spectrum of glorious. So we will all die, bad news, but we can do it gloriously.
I'm not sure if that requires any kind of follow-up, or if that seems like a good point on which to finalize the session. But I don't know if there are any other questions.
Charlotte made a nice point, actually. It's less of a question, but I thought it was a nice point that goes back to your questions of like, how do we end up with a system that works? And she said we need both short route direct and local accountability of services and institutions, and long route accountability, which includes voting and large democratic processes beyond the local. It's not either or. And I think that's a really, you know, we're all trying to find one solution that solves everything. And I think it's probably going to be an amalgamation of everything, isn't it, that moves us forward.
Yeah, I think any big change happens from the top down and the bottom up. It never just happens one way. It has to be both ends. And, you know, and to speak to Patrick's point, we are all going to die, but there is this whole idea of continuation, you know, we do leave something behind as well. So I think we have a responsibility, you know, to remember that, yeah, our time here is finite, you know, and what are we going to do with that? You know, what impact are we going to leave, and what legacy will we leave in terms of our footprint, and what will that look like?
Definitely. And going back to Matt's point right at the beginning, you know, we're so used to combative politics, which feels very short term and very negative and very, you know, circling the drain really. And I think, you know, trying to spend our time in a more collaborative system would leave something much, you know, would leave behind something much better.
Somebody at the door? Citizens Assembly?
Yeah, apparently, yeah, it's a guy asking for my, whether I'm interested.
Yeah. Is that your Citizen Assembly call?
Right. So I guess we're kind of reaching the end of our session. So I guess it's time to thank everyone for your participation. It's been a really interesting session and really enjoyable discussion, hearing all the different ideas and points of view.
It's been absolutely wonderful. So I've just seen we've got some interesting notes in the chat, so please do ignore those for the moment. But apart from that, there are some amazing links in the chat if you go through and look further back up. I'd also like to flag up the fact that we have got a talk on flat pack democracy at 2 o'clock tomorrow with Peter McFadden. So that's going to be a really nice lead on from this chat. And guys, do you want to just remind people where they can find you, either on social media or your websites, if they'd like to follow up and find out more about you. Should we go with Matt first?
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks for the great questions, and brilliant to be on the panel with Patrick, Louise and Jonathan. It's compassioninpolitics.com, but we're on Twitter as COMP in politics, and Facebook as well.
Oh, I know, so Matt, Joe Berry, or Joe Barry, sorry Joe, which one you are, wanted to connect with you, so perhaps she can connect with you through your website.
Yes, yeah, happy to give out my email as well, which is matt@compassioninpolitics.com.
That would
Okay,
be, yeah, thanks everyone for a great panel. That would be Joe Berry, actually, who's on Lynn Franks's panel.
I couldn't find it in the chat. I was like, Joe Barry, it's one of the two. Patrick, where can we find you?
You can find me probably principally on two places. One is the place that I make documentary films, including one that includes Louise, and that is allhandson.doc.com. So allhandson.com. I put it in the chat. And I also write a series on political literacy for the Correspondent. And in fact, I put a Correspondent link into the chat. And that is the idea of writing about things as they are, but also putting up solutions to the problems rather than just moaning about them. So the conversation, the Correspondent, I'll put a link in the chat and then hand over to the next person. Thank you very much for having me.
Louise, where can we find you?
So I've just shared my Twitter handle here. So it's @Caldwell Louise on Twitter. And I just wanted to say thank you to Patrick, actually, Patrick invited me along and for introducing me to Jonathan, and great to meet you too, Matt and Mike and yourself as well, Georgina. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
No, it's been wonderful. Thank you so much. And Jonathan, thank you so much for bringing such amazing panelists with you. How can people find out more about your work?
So there are two websites. There's my personal website, jonathanleighton.org. And if you're interested in finding out more about the organization OPIS and the work we're doing to prevent suffering, the website is preventsuffering.org.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad your tech held up in Greece. It was good to see.
Yeah, usually it works.
Yeah, we've got that. Thank you guys so much for the third panel of today, and I hope you have a lovely sunny solstice weekend full of lots of peace.